You're listening to the Cantina Cast, your home for thought-provoking Star Wars talk. Join Albert and Jonesy in breaking down the latest news, trailers, movies, and of course, your favorite characters from a galaxy far, far away.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Cantina Cast. My name is Albert Padilla, and this is episode 502. No one's ever really gone. Life and death in Star Wars, really. We're going to be talking about a topic that we brought up many, many times before. It's been played out in every format of Star Wars storytelling, whether it's TV, animation, movies. And really, tonight's just going to put a spotlight on that and kind of talk about all the different variations of life after death that exist in Star Wars. What are the rules in who gets to live and who gets to die outside of writing, but within the universe itself, and really kind of get into some of the more nuanced, versions or experiences that people go through in order to come back to life. Joining me tonight is Lauren. Jonesy's off, but Lauren's with us. Lauren, how you doing tonight?
I'm good. I'm happy to be here.
I understand you're quite the expert on life after death. Is there any truth in that? No, I'm kidding. We have we're going to get into that here in just a little bit. We'll get into again some of the examples and all that, but I do want to just quickly give a shout out to all of our Patreon members. We've got some new folks that joined this week, so are now part of the tribe members: Mike, Rob, Lauren, Dante, Risk, Justin, Jackson, as Jonesy likes to say, Sharkman, Dan, Daz, Isabella, and Uncle Leon. And also welcome Jack. Jack joined the $5 tier, now part of the tribe just this week. So thank you, Jack. Really appreciate it. And thank you all of you guys as well. And then on top of that, our Delusions of Grandeur members, which are Rod, Kathy, and Hard Countered. So again, thank you all for all your contributions. If you're a part of Patreon, recently we posted some things about what we've been kind of doing with the money. We've got a show next week that we're going to be doing live. And we've been putting some of the money back into the show to kind of help fund some of these extra things that we're trying to do. So if you're interested in Patreon and you want to see and listen to all the additional content that we've got, head out to cantinacast.com/Patreon. You can sign up there for as little as $1. And then you can see all the brand new perks. We just completely revamped it. There's some great stuff coming down the road here. So encourage everybody to, if you want to be a supporter of the show, even at the smallest amount, head out to Patreon and please donate. We would certainly, sincerely and humbly appreciate that. So, okay. That's the business. Let's get into the actual story. I want to actually, can you plug, what do you got going on with Jedi Novel Archive really quickly here?
Yeah, so I do have my full review for Path of Vengeance coming out on the books release date, which is coming up on Tuesday. So I'm really excited to put that out because this Path of Vengeance was a big one that I was looking forward to. And I know a lot of people feel the same way. So
Yep.
it was definitely one of the highlights for me of the High Republic so far.
And so, yeah, raving reviews, I think, for all across the board. I've seen a lot of people already commenting on that. And as a quick reminder, if you are a Patreon member, after this show is over in about an hour, fingers crossed, we're going to roll right into our a Patreon first, I guess. So it's an exclusive, and that'll be the Tatooine trading post, which is going to be Lauren and I kind of talking about, it's our show and tell segment. We used to do a show and tell segment as part of the main show, and we're trying to get these shows down to smaller consumable sizes. And so we've kind of broken that out, and we're going to go through some of the more recent things that we purchased, whether it's collectibles, action figures, books, all kinds of stuff. I've got two of both. I've got a book that I'm crazy excited to show, and I think it's going to blow people's minds. And I've got an action figure too that I picked up for like $4 that I'm going to open on air, which should be a complete disaster, but it should be a lot of fun too. So again, that'll be at 10 p.m. Central here in less than an hour if you're a Patreon member at the now part of the tribe or above. And then if you're for some of the other tiers, you can get the audio and the video. It just depends once we get that released. So, okay, now that the business is out of the way, I guess the first question is, I mean, we joke about this, right, in Star Wars that no one's ever really gone. What's your feelings on that? Like, do you feel like that washes away, and we've talked about this just more recently with, Kino Loy was an example. We talked about Tech, right? In the Bad Batch and how he died. And I guess how much have they brought people back to the point now where it feels like, I don't know, it's not as impactful, or do you feel like it's very situational? It just really depends on the story and the characters.
For me, it's very situational because, I mean, if we think back to like the original trilogy, it was set up very early on that in this world that the story takes place in, the divide between life and death is very thin. Like we have force ghosts all throughout it. So to me, like the concept of people being able to come back or people being able to communicate with the living, that is totally fine to me. And I have no problem with that. Where it starts to get a little bit more based on the situation is when it's a reason that doesn't seem to be super steeped in the already established lore, or if it's something that seems kind of like a cobbled together reason at the last minute. So I feel like it's very dependent on the way that it's written and the way that it's explained.
And I would say like some deaths seem very they're much more meaningful than others. You know, Wade from the Kenobi series,
Oh no.
not very meaningful.
No, I thought you
I'm
were
kidding. That's a deep cut for anybody that remembers that guy who died a horrible death. And then there's certainly characters like Tech, where I mean, it's still kind of like shocking, right? And I would agree, like it does feel very situational, even though they've teased the idea that no one's ever really gone in Star Wars, right? This is a quote from Luke Skywalker, and I think in the context of that, he was kind of talking about, specifically Ben Solo, right? He was talking to Leia. She was thinking her son was gone. He had become someone else, which is kind of one of the examples that we're going to talk about tonight. And it was his reassurance to her that, look, that's not true. Look at my father. Look at our father, right? Everybody thought he was completely gone, transformationally, physically, metaphysically, every way you can possibly think of, and yet he still came back. He still was rebirthed again, or came resurrected at the very end of Return of the Jedi in some ways. So that was kind of really what the context was. But in we joke about that Star Wars that no one's ever really gone because we get a lot of these characters that come back in different formats and different ways. So, what are the rules? Like in your own words, and this is a loaded question,
Yeah.
but what are the rules around who gets to live and who gets to die and stay dead?
Yeah, that's tough because I feel like we haven't really seen any rules actually being established on this, so it's difficult to pinpoint what they would be if I had them because like if you're comparing like I'll just use an example like Palpatine versus Maul, the two Sith characters that were we thought they were dead were brought back. One of them worked and one of them did not work. And so I don't know what the rules would be because in some cases they just pull it off and in other cases they just don't.
Yeah.
So I think maybe it has to do with like, first of all, do we want the character to come back? That's probably a big rule. And then in addition to that, kind of goes back to like, if it's well written, then I feel like we probably could buy it. And if it's not well written, then I guess not.
And some of it goes back to the we did an episode where we talked about Lawrence Kasdan versus George Lucas and their kind of philosophical approach to how characters live and die, who lives, who dies, the rules, right? And I think it was episode 477. If anybody's interested in going back, it was a really fun show to do. So yeah, I'm with you. It just really depends. I hate to say that it's like a money grab, but I mean, everybody was pretty excited about the Rise of Skywalker, and then when the idea that Palpatine was coming back, now the execution was maybe a little bit different, right? But I don't know that anybody was really not excited about. I mean, just the potential, right, of what that story was going to be. Now the execution, well, that was, you know, probably not my favorite. They probably could have done some more there, but so that one does feel like it was more for, I don't know. I hate to say money grab, but it was a way to get people interested in talking about the movie and certainly go to see it because Palpatine was coming back and that's like the big bad, right? But did it really make sense? I don't know. I mean, I guess it does in the end for that story, but I guess it really wasn't my favorite either in terms of how it landed.
Well, and I remember when everyone was first talking about that before we actually saw the movie, I was one of those people that was like, no, this fits with the lore that we have already had established. This is exactly what he's talking about in Revenge of the Sith, like beating death.
Hmm.
It does technically, it should be able to fit. So, yeah, I mean, I agree with you that the execution is, I think, what killed it in that sense.
And I guess to get into the characters now, so we've looked at, so that's kind of like the technical behind the scenes stuff about who lives, who dies, but getting into the actual characters now. So that's a little bit different. It feels like if you're not I guess everybody has the ability to come back with technology. And we'll talk about the different variations and whose mileage runs better than others. And then I guess one of the standards, at least from canon, with the exception of Palpatine now, but traditionally, historically, the Sith were never able to kind of come back to life. There are examples. I'm not saying there aren't. We are going to get into the examples, but when we get to canon, they never really were. And for the Jedi, it was a an ability that was long lost, and through Qui-Gon's, exploration and tuning and being in tune with the Force, he was able to kind of find that power again, and it was transferred to all the other characters, and we'll get into here as well. So it felt like the rules were right. Getting back to what the rules are, if you're a Jedi, you had the ability to come back. If you were a Sith, the best that you could probably do, again from canon, not legends, but the best you could do from canon was possess somebody or possess an object, but you really weren't back, right? You weren't really kind of physically back, and you weren't spiritually back. There was always a penalty of sorts. So the only ones that really got to truly get to come back, I guess, are maybe the technology people. So it could be like droids and humanoids and all that. But I don't know, anything you want to add there before we get into some of the examples. I do want to talk about some of the other kind of the rebirths that aren't physical in nature, right? More metaphysical as well.
Yeah, I mean, from the technology aspect, that does feel like something that is pretty much within reach for everybody within the Star Wars universe. It's just more a matter of, is it accessible at the time of their death?
Yep.
But it is like, I mean, that's an easy one because pretty much anybody could benefit from that if the circumstances are right. What you were saying about the Sith too was, it definitely does feel like almost not quite as permanent in a way because of how they do have to rely on external objects and kind of like a process of putting their spirit into that object. That I agree that comparing the Sith with the Jedi, it's a very different type of effect that happens.
Jonesy is with us tonight. He's in the chat. He just chimed in and said, in concept, that Uncle Palpy had to manufacture his life after death was perfect. Fits in with George Lucas's vision of Jedi while pulling in Legends ideals. And he's right. In Legends, there was, the Dark Empire series where Palpatine was cloning his body. We're seeing some of this now in slight variations, or they're kind of pulling from that stuff. But he was creating these different clones, and he was coming back into the clones. The only downside was every time he came into one of these clones, the clone's body was deteriorated in some point. So it almost had like a diminishing returns, right, on the vitality of the clone itself. And so it was a limited run, and that's really gets into the whole Dark Empire thing and him trying to get into Luke's body or whatever it was. So yeah, the manufacturing piece of it, that manufacturing component, certainly aligns with the what we saw in the Rise of Skywalker. And so we're going to talk about, like, again, the metaphysical. I would say there's an example of reincarnation. So in some way, it's not 100% clear in terms of how that works, but it feels like they did kind of play with that a little bit here. Force ghosts, force spirits. Canonically, I think they're force spirits. Force ghosts is a Legends thing. There's character resets. You think of like Anakin Skywalker is potentially one of those. He kind of fits a couple of different bills. But I guess, is there anything that you feel like is off limits or just doesn't feel like Star Wars? And this isn't the full list, right? We're only talking about stuff that's in Star Wars. But if you think beyond that and think about other ways characters come back to life in other IPs or the other comic books, movies, is there anything that you feel like is just off limits and we shouldn't get into? I mean, like zombies is one that I think people were kind of scoffing at when we were going down that path in Legends, and I don't know that we'll ever get there with canon, but technically that's a rebirth, right? They've come back to life, even though they're, quote, the undead. But is there anything like that you feel like would be a no-go for Star Wars?
Well, the Night Sisters do kind of have some zombie stuff going on with the armies of the dead and everything, but
No, that's true. You're right.
yeah.
They're such a cool exception, but keep going.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to not be on board with an army of the dead, right? I don't know if there's really that much that is off limits. Because to me, just the way that we already have so many different options, I'm like, what's adding on a couple
Hmm.
more? Like, it doesn't really feel like, I mean, like, because Rebels with adding what happened with Kanan, that was kind of like, a little bit different than what we're used to, but I felt like it worked great. And in fact, I would like to see more of that. So I think if it fits with the story that they're telling, then go for it.
Well, let's talk about some of these very specifically. So we'll start really quick with the humanoids and the droids. I mean, we've got examples like Fennec Shan, Boba Fett. Both of those are very recent examples where they kind of came back from life. For Fennec Shan, she's enhanced, right? She's got droid parts now, more woman or more machine than woman, I guess. Not really. She's only got the abdomen or whatever it was. But I mean, technically, she died. I mean, that's how it was explained to us. I would assume she had no pulse, no heart rate, and somehow they brought her back to life and then gave her the components that she needed for that life to be sustainable, right? For Boba Fett, that was I mean, that one's a little weird. It was almost like a spiritual death. It was a physical death. Maybe he was kind of in between life and death for a while there, just getting eaten, digested, whatever was going on there. But how did you feel about Fennec Shan? And then certainly, how did you feel about the Boba Fett scenario and how he came back to life in the book of Boba Fett?
Both of those characters, I feel like the way that the deaths were handled, it was written in such a way that it did make sense to me. Like with Fennec Shand, with him finding her just right in the nick of time, bringing her to have her entire abdomen replaced. I mean, in the technological advancements that Star Wars has, to me that fits. So, and I love her as a character, so it's hard to complain about her being brought back to life because then we got to spend more time with her. But with Boba
Yeah,
Fett,
yeah.
I guess he was in kind of like a hibernation state while he was being slowly digested, which is kind of strange to think about. But I mean, with the way that his armor protected him, I mean, sure. That one wasn't as explained as well as some other ones are, but I was willing to go with it for the sake of having the character back.
Yeah, and he talks as though he died, right? Like his character was dead. He believes that. And I think for us as viewers, I think we were looking at it more like, okay, no, you're not really dead. You were just suffering for a long time. And maybe you were going in and out of consciousness and, but you never technically died. If we want to go down that path, then I don't know. The Tusken Raiders, they would have had to have done something, right, to resurrect him after he crawled out of there on his own will. Maybe he came back to life while he's down there. Once he fell out or once he came out, did they resurrect him with their medicines and spirituality or whatever that is they did, right? So I get it. I think for his though, it is. I think it's more of a metaphysical character transformation, rebirth than a physical death. But I think it still counts in terms of our topic tonight. The droids are interesting because, like there's we talked about IG-88 in one of the shows recently. We were talking about when we were theorizing about IG-11, and earlier on we thought he was going to be doing what IG-88 was doing, which was he would upload his consciousness, right, as a droid into some mothership or whatever it was. And so he would just like make replicas of himself. He just clone himself, to physically clone himself, create new IG-88s, IG units. And then every time he died, he just kind of transferred right back into his the new one. So he was always around, always living. But the one that I always find the funniest is C-3PO, because like R2-D2 gets a free pass on everything. That dude has never had his mind wiped. Never, he remembers everything that happened, and yet, of course, C-3PO at the, right before we get to A New Hope, they wipe his mind and send him over to Captain Antilles, which explains very conveniently why he has that line in Episode 4. Our last our last master was Captain Antilles. But are there any other droids, or I guess your thoughts, I guess, on C-3PO and IG-11, maybe IG-12 now? And then I want to ask you too, for IG-12, do you think now that he's IG-11 again, like how much of what he had or who he was has been retained, if anything?
Yeah, so for 3PO, it's funny because I was also thinking of the example from The Rise of Skywalker when I don't know if you remember this, but in the trailer, when they put that line of
Yeah,
like, take one last look at my friends. And in that trailer, I was like, are they going to kill 3PO? And it was like, I was nervous because I felt like that would have been
yeah, right.
totally the wrong thing to do. But thankfully, they didn't do that. And in that actual scene, it didn't actually feel like he was dying to me. I was like, oh, good. This is like not that big of a deal. He's just getting his mind wiped for like the millionth time.
Yep, yep.
So yeah, with 3PO, I mean, it just almost feels like that's part of his character is that he has to get his mind wiped every once in a while. But with IG-11, I felt kind of unclear as to if it is still the same IG-11 that we knew in season 1 of Mando, or if the IG-11 that we have now is like a different version named like, in honor of him,
Yeah.
or IG-12, I guess. Yeah, so that one I'm not sure. I almost feel like I need to see more of the character to really know, but, I mean, he sounds like him
Hmm.
and acts like him so far, so
Yeah, it'll be interesting. We'll get to see. Hopefully, I don't know. We will honestly. We talked about this at the end of season 3, Mandalorian, about whether or not when do we go back to Navarro, right? And now he's got a very kind of specific role where he is the marshal of that town. So unless Navarro is like under attack or there's a story to be told there on Navarro, I don't know that we're going to get much of him. Maybe there's maybe there is an opportunity later on where Mando comes to Grief Karga and says, "Hey, Thrawn's back. We need everybody we can get. I need IG-11 because we did something pretty special at one point, right?" And so maybe that's the way they kind of pull him in, but it almost feels like, I don't know, he's just kind of landlocked at this point because he's just going to be there on Navarro, and that's his lot in life. So I'm glad he did get a second chance, though, right? I'm glad he was rebirthed, even if he isn't the same character, doesn't have the same memories and all that. Well, I guess that'll be determined, but it was just a great character to have. And I just remember that season, that the battle that they had together, and the comedic timing of Pedro Pascal and Taika Waititi's lines, and that's really just editing more than anything. I get it, but it was a good combo that I'd like to see that buddy cop experience again at some point.
Yeah, I liked how they worked together.
Okay, so you already cracked the seal on our the wild card in all of this, right? Because it's very clean when we get to, like, for me, it feels like it's very clean when we talk about Jedi, we talk about Sith, droids, humanoids, technology, but the Night Sisters, right? So they fit into this, like, which is such a cool concept. And I really was when I was putting the show notes together, I thought they really needed to explore this more. They need to explore the whole Night Sisters and the witchcraft of Star Wars more. I don't think we've got enough of it. I mean, we had plenty of it, I think, in the Clone Wars, right? But I really would love to see, like, a series based on this, or just know more about the ins and outs of it. But and there are rumors, by the way, that we might get a Mother Talzin showing up in the Acolyte. I was reading about that earlier today, and I thought, oh my God, that'd be amazing if they did that, or an old DACA, or we get to see some of the Night Sister stuff in there. So, anyways, I'm just throwing that out there as just a fun little teaser kind of rumor. But the Night Sisters, so they get to do, like, everything. It feels like they can enhance people. There's examples where they brought people back to life, literally almost like zombies. I forget the episode where old DACA was resurrecting, like, armies of people to fight. I think it was the Separatists at the time. So they have, like, an insta army if they ever need one there. They needed one there on Dathomir, right? So, but yeah, what else? What other? How do you feel about the Night Sisters, witchcraft, I guess, and is it really fair given they can just willfully do this at any point?
Well, with the Night Sisters resurrecting people, it felt like there was another cool example of Marin doing that in Jedi Battle Scars too. But the impression that I got was that these zombies are not really they're not really sentient. They're kind of just being
Zombies.
driven. Yeah, they're just being driven around to, like, serve a purpose. So I feel like with the Night Sisters resurrecting people, I'm not sure if they have the capability to, like, actually resurrect a full-on person as they were. Do they?
Didn't they do that with Ventress?
Okay.
I want to say that somebody, I can't remember if it was Ventress or someone else, that they put her on the table and did all that. And they did that they did that with Savage, not bring him back to life, but they certainly enhanced him and gave him, like, physical powers, right? Physical brawnness and all that. But they just have a way of tapping into, like really the dark arts. And it's, like, not even the stuff that the Sith do, which is interesting.
I guess what I'm trying to get at is it feels like with the Night Sisters, there are limitations as to how, like, what they can accomplish. It doesn't feel like that they have just, like, endless power to do this whenever. Like, it feels like the circumstances have to be a certain way. So
Hmm.
since there are some sort of rules to it, I feel good about there being parameters. It's not just like they can do whatever they want, which I think is that's good insurance to have.
I just wonder too, like, if it feels like if there is anybody that could bring back characters to life in, almost like a Frankenstein, or in its true form, without penalties, feels like they probably were going to be the ones that figure it out more than the Sith, and certainly the Jedi. I mean, the Jedi seem like they've already just, I mean, it seems unethical, right, from a Jedi's perspective to even consider this.
Yeah.
Force spirit, totally different, right? We're not really there. We're not, messing with life and death and that kind of thing. We're living on beyond that through the Force. I think the Sith, and that's going to be a nice transition because we're going to talk about the Sith next. But from the Sith, I mean, they absolutely want to come back, and they want to have fresh bodies or pristine bodies or young bodies, being able to do all the things they want to retain all of their memories. They want no penalties. And again, at times there was a time when this was feasible and doable by the Sith, but again, they've been relegated to possession and possessing people or possessing objects or imbuing their force with objects themselves. But it does feel like if there is any one group, it's going to be the Night Sisters that probably tap into this or figure out how to actually do this. So
I could see that.
here's a question I have for you then, I guess, about the Sith. Like, it does feel like it is something that's always beyond their grasp, but why is it that it's so elusive? I mean, growing up, did you ever have your own theories as to why this was and why it is so elusive for the Sith, for a concept for them to learn?
Yeah, I just felt like it's because they don't have the same insight into the Force that the Jedi have. So because of that, they're not able to be fully effective with it. Um, because since the Jedi, they have a fundamentally different relationship, and with the Sith, it's more about power and what they can get from the Force and how they can use it. And so with that perspective, that doesn't really fit in with like the perspective and the understanding of like how we're all connected that's I feel needed to be able to separate your actual selfhood from the cosmic force. So to me, I just felt like they just weren't on the same level spiritually, I guess in a nutshell.
And that's kind of how, until we got the, it's still not official, right? And I want to talk about a couple things here. So there's still not an official explanation as to why the Sith can't become Force spirits. And I know I've had arguments on Twitter about this and other places, and I can tell you right now, there is no official answer. People will cite the Revenge of the Sith script. Okay, so in one of the drafts of Revenge of the Sith, George Lucas had written that the Sith were incapable of becoming Force ghosts because they didn't have absolute selflessness, right? Which is something that Jedi have. I think the quote I wrote it in here. The quote was something along the lines of achieving internal consciousness required absolute selflessness, and the Sith are incapable of that. In fact, they're the absolute opposite to what, kind of like what you were saying, right? They're all about themselves, right? They're the most narcissistic, self-centered, selfish people, right? Because of the Force, the dark side, because it corrupts them, because it makes them want more and more, and so the further they dive into that, the further they move away from ever achieving eternal life because of that selflessness. That was George Lucas's concept. Again, it was in a script, it was pulled out. So is it canon? No, technically it's not, because it never made it into the movie. I think there was actually a scene that they had filmed, or it was early. They did a couple of lines. And Qui-Gon Jinn is the one that was a part of this in Revenge of the Sith, believe it or not. He was going to be talking to Yoda and kind of explaining, this part. And this is eventually what turned into some of the lost episodes of the Clone Wars, right? They kind of took a lot of those concepts, put them into the Clone Wars, and kind of fleshed it out a little bit there. It's a different variation. But the one thing that is very interesting is we have the 40th anniversary of Return of the Jedi, of course, around the corner. And we have, from a certain point of view, right, the Return of the Jedi novel. And it's Mike Chen, of all people. So author Mike Chen has a story that he's writing, but it's essentially going to be talking about, it says, Anakin Skywalker becomes one with the Force in a gripping tale by Mike Chen. So we're going to get the story of when Anakin dies, or when, I guess, after he saves Luke Skywalker, somewhere, I'm assuming they're on the Death Star, in transport, whenever it was he finally croaked over and became one with the Force. We're going to get that story. So it is going to be interesting to see, like, how Anakin was able to become a Force ghost, Force spirit, when what we knew up until this point was it had to be taught. Yeah. So very cool stuff. I think there's actually a second story in there as well about Force ghosts in some way. And I know we had like two originally in the very first version of From A New Hope, from a certain point of view. But yeah, so I think some of that may explain or tap into why Sith can't do it, or give us some more background on how the process works. And maybe that kind of helps us draw the conclusions as to why the Sith can't do it. But they found other ways to kind of live on. Any thoughts around that before I kind of get into some of these other characters here? We're going to talk about Palpatine again, because he's our favorite.
Yeah, I would be surprised if they gave, because to me the selflessness line that was in the script, to me that still kind of fits in with what we were saying about like a fundamentally different use of the Force. It would be difficult for me to accept any sort of answer that's not at least somewhat in line with that, because I really can't think of what other reason there could possibly be, but that the Mike Chen story does sound like it's gonna be really cool, so I would love to get, like, a more in-depth explanation of that.
So let's talk about Palpatine quickly, because so Palps. I mean, eh, ugh. So when he dies in Return of the Jedi, what led us to Dark Empire and all of the legend stuff about how he lived was the idea that we saw this spirit or energy or something that came out of the shaft after Vader pitched him and yeeted him down there, right? And so that was enough for people to think, oh, is he dead? Is he not dead? I think for me, it was always clear that he had died until we got to Dark Empire, and they brought him back to life there. Going back to canon, this is the whole Project Necromancer that we got teased about in Mando season 3, right?
Mhm.
So we know that they are kind of working on this and clone. So again, they're kind of picking and choosing different things here. But I mean, technically he died. I wish, I don't know, the way it was handled in terms of the Rise of Skywalker and the way the messaging was. I mean, I think it was in Fortnite or whatever it was that they announced it. Like he first came back and said, I'm back, everybody. It was, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, but it was in Fortnite that they did that. So just the way it was handled was just kind of weird. Do you think there would have been any other better option for them to? I mean, what could they have done to like make that his return more meaningful or purposeful, other than the meme that we now have of Poe Dameron going, somehow Palpatine has returned.
I mean, that's exactly what I was about to blame was that line because
Poe Dameron.
yeah, poor Poe. I mean, he probably didn't
Poor
wanna
Poe.
say
Yeah, he'd
that.
be the deliverer.
Yeah.
Yep.
He had to be the person to say it. Yeah, because to me, like, it's like I was talking about earlier with Revenge of the Sith, like, the clues are there that if they really wanted to string that together, I feel like that they could. Even though I don't love it, but it's possible. So, I mean, the things are there to do it. So, I mean, I think if there had been like a more in-depth explanation in The Rise of Skywalker when he's being reintroduced, not this somehow Palpatine returned business, I think I would have been much more
Mm,
willing to be generous with my interpretation of how that all went because I do tend to be generous with my interpretations of things, so, like, I feel like I'm a pretty easy viewer to, like, get on board with things. So I think just a little
yep.
bit
Yep.
more in depth of an explanation would have done it for me, and it would have been enough.
Do you feel like Shadow of the Sith did anything for you on that front? Because I mean, they got into Dathan, and yeah.
Yeah, I do feel like it did, and also with, like, the explanation that it gave of how, like, Exium Panchard put his spirit into the mask and all of that, I was like, "Okay, so
Hmm.
it's being explained how a Sith or being explained further, I guess, how a Sith could put their spirit into something." We're seeing an example of that, like, a more recent example. So I'm like, "Okay, yeah, that's enough." That's some
Yeah.
context clues that I think are helpful. It's not the same as if they would have put it in the actual film, but it definitely helped.
And it just feels like I mean, I don't know. Well, I don't want to quarterback this. We'll move on. I mean, it's a dead horse, and we've talked about it enough even later on. But let's talk about the human cockroach, or the Dathomir cockroach of Star Wars, and Darth Maul. This is one that the again, on paper, the idea that Darth Maul was going to come back to Star Wars was like crazy. Like, this is the dumbest thing in the world. It was almost as dumb for me, like with Palpatine, and thinking about that, right? But and yet, like, they pulled it off, right? In my opinion, they pulled it off extremely well. Now, granted, they had a series to kind of give us a lot of episodes and really kind of put a lot of time and thought and care into getting us on board as to how somebody could come back from life that way, and then not only just come back from life, but then suddenly a have legs, right? And then and be able to be very effective, and still kind of, and you think about where he is when we get to, not Rebels, because he was pretty crazy at that point. But I mean, at his height, arguably, was during the Siege of Mandalore and his fight with Ahsoka, and how incredible that was, and where I mean, he was, he was controlling the Shadow Syndicate at that point, and right. So there was, I mean, he did well for himself. But how did you feel about the Maul return, and what he went through his journey?
Yeah, I agree that on paper it sounds completely bonkers, but I think a key part of the reason why they were able to pull it off is I feel like a lot of us felt like we didn't get enough time with Maul in the Phantom Menace, and he was such a cool character that we wish that we could have done more with him. So I feel like the people were
Yeah.
already primed to accept him coming back, which hasn't, that wasn't really the case with some other characters that will not be named. But Like,
Right.
him coming back and the time that they took to explain it and the things that they did with his character after coming back, because he was part of some really important stories going forward. So, to me, all of that combined is what made it work.
And to be clear, his the way I guess I interpreted this was he lived or was able to keep himself alive, keep a pulse, because I don't know that he technically ever physically died, right? He was so consumed by anger and hate and the torture that Palpatine had pushed him through that when he was at that bottom of the pit, severed in half. I mean, he was feeding off the negative energy and that anger and that hate was what really kept him alive. It gave him a pulse until he could be picked up, dragged off, and then the Dathomir sisters came in, gave him legs, and right, and we won't get into the whole story there, but that's essentially how he kind of continued on. So it does show how powerful he was in the dark side to be able to kind of hold on and cling to life for the sake of just pure hatred, right, and anger, which is what fuels the Sith in a lot of ways, and it's going to be a nice segue into the next character here as well. But yeah, that's kind of how he lived, and he really did kind of go through a lot. I mean, he was reborn in some ways. He went so far as to almost denounce being a Sith at some point, right? Because of the bad taste in his mouth from Palpatine and Dooku, and he was wanting to kill Anakin. He wanted to kill Anakin to get back at Palpatine. So there was a revenge aspect in there, and then eventually his whole life settled on revenge for Kenobi and everything that Kenobi had put him through. When Kenobi didn't really give a crap about him, he was like, "Yeah, whatever, dude. You're nothing to me," kind of thing. So, but I do want to talk about just quickly one character that this is Legends. This is a character named Tenebrae. And so Tenebrae has a lot of different names. And I promise I'm going to keep this very short, but he is one of the examples where he was able to physically do something called a transfer of essence, the proper term. And this actually came from the Star Wars role-playing games. So there's Jonesy's Easter egg there. But yeah, they were able to transfer their life force into another body. It's a very similar story for him, for Momin, and for Eggs and Panchard. So I want to kind of group all these together. All of these, with the exception of Tenebrae, are canon, but they all have a very similar story. Very young age, very powerful in the Force, but very sick and twisted. For Tenebrae, I mean, he kills his parents at a very young age. He realizes that the more he kills and mutilates people, the more powerful he becomes. And he becomes obsessed with this. I mean, he's basically a serial killer. And he goes through this a number of years. Like by age 10, he's pretty much ruling his own planet because he's so powerful in the Force. There's a master that sees him, decides that they want to kind of make him his apprentice. He eventually kills that person. And he lives for almost like 1,500 years. And a large part of that is him transferring whenever he starts to get old, weak, he transfers his life right into another soul and into another body, possesses him essentially, right? And he has all the same consciousness, all the same memories. I mean, it's a perfect world for the Sith, and I think this is really what Palpatine and others are kind of grasping it. They know that this person lived, and it was possible at some point, even though it's Legends. And that, to me, that is kind of life eternal. Yeah, it wasn't until eventually he ended up going into a couple of different people, and at one point he possessed like an entire city of people, right? So this is how crazy powerful he is. And we're talking like 15,000 years ago, right? Very, very long time in terms of Star Wars. So so that's a good example. But then we have also like Momin and Exarm Panchard, who are both characters that were, again, very sick in their ways at a young age. For Momin, he was mutilating animals and creating art. For Exarm Panchard, I think he was a viceroy, and he was killing people like by the hundreds. And then, the voices and the screams, the pain, the hatred was getting imbued in this mask that he was wearing, which allowed him to kind of live on through the mask. Same thing with like Momin. Momin was able to live on to the mask. I mean, there's two examples in canon where we've got these Sith lords that were psychopaths, that were mass murderers. And because of that, they were able to channel the dark side and make it strong enough that they could live on past their physical life. So I know this is all kind of like really disturbing stuff, and it's probably the darker side of Star Wars, but how do you feel about those characters, and any other thoughts around, like, do you think we'll ever get anybody else like this in maybe in the future here?
Yeah, the act of like I remember with X and Panchard, it was like the way it was explained was it was the more atrocities he committed, it gave him the power to put. So it was kind of like there was an incentive to
I think we lost you. You fix your audio. I'm going to keep going here. There was an incentive there for these characters to continue to do what they did because the more they did it, the more powerful they became. And eventually that led them into the idea of being able to live beyond death, in a lot of ways. So that's Momin, that's Panchard. Let's talk about the good guys. So this is the Jedi. And the Jedi, of course, we've already talked a little bit about Force ghosts, Force spirits, as they are, again, in canon. There's a lot of examples. And from a canon perspective, we know that Qui-Gon Jinn was really the first person to kind of pick up this power. It was all through, if you haven't seen the Clone Wars, I think there's 3 episodes in there where Yoda visits what is it, the priestess of the Force, the Wills, or whatever it is, and he gets to learn a lot of this stuff. But even before then, Qui-Gon Jinn had tapped into this, and he was starting to experiment with it and starting to begin to understand it. And eventually, he of course he passes that on to Yoda, who passes it on to Luke Skywalker, Princess Leia at some point, right? They all kind of come back as Force ghosts, as Force spirits. But this all really started with Qui-Gon Jinn from that Shaman of the Wills, which again is another thing that was never really official. I think it was in one of the scripts again that there was a Shaman of the Wills in which he learned from it, who belonged to the Ancient Order of the Wills. And this goes back to that Journal of the Wills, which is what George Lucas had originally scripted out. To kind of get into some of the other Force entities, I want to talk about quickly the scene at the end of The Rise of Skywalker, because that was a really surprising scene when Rey, gets up and we start hearing all the voices of, Ahsoka and Kanan. Ayla Secura was in there, Adi Gallia was in there, Mace Windu, and then Luminari was in there as well. So all of these people are speaking, but I think the questions that I had was whether or not those people actually had lived on as Force ghosts. Because in my head, it feels like maybe they were Force entities. Because then it feels like we've opened up this, right? If it was something to be taught, all of these people that we hear at the end of The Rise of Skywalker weren't really taught how to live beyond that, unless they were taught in the afterlife in some way, or there's some explanation there. So in my head, it feels like they're almost kind of in this like limbo state, right? They're disembodied voices that are tuned into the Force. We can certainly hear them. They can speak to Rey because, as powerful as she is in that moment, whatever it is. But to my knowledge, they never were trained or they never learned how to become Force spirits or Force ghosts, right? So I do have questions around The Rise of Skywalker and so how some of these characters actually were able to speak, given they actually were never trained. So I'll pause there. Lauren, are you back? I see you. Let's see if you got audio.
I'm having some technical issues. I probably do not sound super great right now, do I?
You sound fine. We'll take it.
Okay.
Yeah, so I don't mean to put you on the spot. Hopefully, I don't know if you heard any of that, but I was talking about that scene in The Rise of Skywalker when they're all speaking to Rey. Like, some of those characters never were trained on how to become Force ghosts, right? From like the way Yoda was or Kenobi or anybody else, but yet they were speaking. Do you feel like they actually got trained in the afterlife, or do you feel like they were just being channeled and they could speak but you could never see you wouldn't see a physical form? I mean, how would you explain like Luminara and Ayla Secura, Kanan was never trained either, right? So how did they get to make it back?
Yeah, that one is tough for me to make sense of because I feel like the thing that would have to be learned about becoming a full-on Force ghost would be that act of separating the self from the cosmic force. So if they didn't learn how to do that, it's tough for me to conceptualize how they would be able to do that with just their voice. But I like the idea of those characters being able to still communicate. So maybe there is like some kind of an explanation that I would be open to hearing, but it's difficult to make sense of without knowing more.
Yeah, I almost feel like it's like light side purgatory, right? You're not dead. You're not technically in heaven. Heaven being, part of the cosmic force, but there's somewhere in between, like in limbo, in that purgatory state where they can still, they might be able to commune, or they might be able to just chime in or give a hurrah to somebody at time whenever it's needed most. But it was an interesting time. I mean, I do love that scene a lot. It's one of the better scenes, I think, in The Rise of Skywalker. And it really gets you kind of pumped and going. But I'm scratching my head going, wait a minute, where the heck did all these people come from? And why are they suddenly being able to speak from the dead as Luke and, all the other people that we know went about it the right way, I guess, if you will. Okay, so we talked about reincarnation. And I'm using quotes for reincarnation because in Star Wars Rebels, Kanan dies. And, well, shocker. If you haven't seen it, Kanan dies. Still pissed about it, but in a good way. But Kanan dies, and it's that I think it's the episode right after, or a couple episodes a little bit later, that we get the Doom Wolf, right? The Loth Wolf, who goes by the name of Doom. He's able to speak. He's got Kanan's symbol on his head, right? It's like a physical symbol there, the same symbol that he had on his little shoulder pad there thing. And so whenever I remember watching those episodes thinking, okay, he was reincarnated. This is kind of cool. Like we've never really had reincarnation in Star Wars, or reincarnation through like an animal, but at the same time, we see him or hear him talk again at the Rise of Skywalker. So we got to figure that out at some point. We won't do it on this show, so put that aside. But is that truly a reincarnation, or is that some kind of a cosmic force, cosmic thing? Did Kanan find a way to talk to Ezra and help him, guide him when he needed him the most through this wolf? And really, he's still dead. He's still going to become a Force ghost, but he found yet another loophole or another mechanism of communing with somebody like Ezra whenever, again, when Ezra needed him. How did you interpret that? And do you feel like it's a kind of a reincarnation of sorts?
I definitely do feel that it was Kanan in the wolf form. I don't know if reincarnation, I guess what I think of reincarnation, I'm thinking about him living his entire life as this wolf, or the entire lifespan of the wolf's life in the wolf's body, which I don't think that's what happened. And I don't think anybody thinks that's what happened, but it's almost like he was temporarily in the body of the wolf to be able to still guide Ezra, impart the message that he needed to impart. And it felt like once that was handled, then he was able to move on and kind of be more cosmic force, just in that way. But it almost makes me wonder too if he's able to take on this wolf form at will,
Hmm.
which I don't know, maybe that remains to be seen. I'm not sure, but it's kind of like a sort of temporary reincarnation, I guess would be the short answer to that.
It is, yeah, and I get it. I mean, there's probably a couple different explanations. It's not really clear. I think from the story, it worked really great. Do you remember? I think you watched it recently, but how did that wolf? How did he leave? Didn't he just like run off into the distance in one of the episodes, and that was the last we saw?
Yes. Yeah,
Okay.
it was left somewhat open-ended, I feel like, and there was a moment where Hera
Hmm.
was like, "He's really gone now." It's hard to know for sure, but I love this idea of being able to take on, like, some sort of a significant animal form instead of the Force Ghost. I hope that that's something that we see more of because I thought that was really cool.
So I guess the last two examples that we have are actually Jedi examples where people came back to life, like physically came back to life. In both instances, they're very similar. I don't know if the first one is Rey in The Rise of Skywalker. It's not the first one in terms of like the timeline, but Rey Skywalker died. Right? She was dead, and Ben Solo, rest in peace. Moment of silence. He's actually imbues her with the force and is able to bring her back to life, right? That's that whole scene that happens. He gives his life to her and allows her to live on. And so she died, she came back. So that's a very real example. Now, that can be explained because of the dyad, their strength in the force together. I mean, there's probably different ways. I never walked away from that thinking, okay, now this is just a force power anybody can do. I think this is a really crazy example, extreme example of force, attunement, and power. Again, the dyad kind of charging that. But would you agree with that, or do you think there's an opportunity here for the Jedi to like just say, okay, yeah, we can bring people back to life, and then morally, I mean, I don't know, the Jedi would. That doesn't feel like something they would actually do, though.
Yeah, it almost feels like potentially messing with the will of the Force a little bit too much, but the way I interpreted that was it was very much dependent on the circumstances of them being a dyad. That's why it was something that was possible. I don't think it's within
Hmm.
like anybody's reach. So
Yeah,
that one, I think we could potentially see some future examples of like a similar type of situation, but I think the exact way that that went down, it seemed very dyad dependent.
I would agree. That's the easiest way to explain it. And then the other example that we have is Ahsoka Tano. And again, there are very extreme circumstances here. So there's for anybody that's not familiar with the Mortis trilogy of episodes, if you're a listener of this show, you're probably sick of us talking about this thing. But in the Mortis trilogy, Ahsoka Tano actually physically dies, and it's through the sister, who are these like celestial beings. They're all powerful. They live eternally, right? We won't get into all the specifics of them, but they are extremely powerful in the Force. They end up she gives up her life for Ahsoka Tano to come back to life, and it's a great that whole series is amazing. But again, we were talking about superhuman, super Force beings here at play. So it's nothing that could be repeatable, I would think, right? It would have to be somebody like one of those guys or the Bendu, or I mean, I'm sure there are other characters that are to be called out at some point that have this ability. But again, those are the only two examples that I recall where we actually had in canon where we had a physical person die in as part of the light side and come back to life and still have like all their memories, and there were no like downsides to them coming back to life at all, really.
Yeah, it also makes me wonder if we're gonna see the world between worlds used as another form of physical rebirth in like a certain type of weird way.
It has the potential, I would agree. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like it's within the realm of possibility, which would be a whole nother can of worms.
It would be, and I think if they went down that path, I mean, I think they're going to. It would be one of these cautionary tale kind of things, right? Where people do it and everything seems like it's fine, and yet there's the repercussions and the downsides are just going to be so great that it's quickly realized that this is not a path, and which I kind of think that's where they kind of went with Rebels and kind of shutting that place down, right? How it all kind of self destructed. It should not be made available to anyone because of the potential. We assume that the world between worlds is still out there. They made mention that there are other portals, other ways to get into it, not just the one that was seen in Rebels. So to your point, I think that would have a potential to kind of bring back this idea of, can we bring back people that were dead, pull them from an alternate timeline into our existing timeline? What does that do to them? What does that do to the galaxy at large? I think all of that is it morally correct and all that. I think that's all going to play into that if we go there. So, but yeah, it's again, in general, I would say life after death is certainly possible. Your mileage may vary depending on who you are, whether you're aligned with the dark side, the light side, the circumstances, the technology available to the characters, at the time of death or even beyond. I guess maybe the final question is, do you feel like life and death, or like life after death, is used sparingly enough in Star Wars? And it kind of goes back to the very first question, but now that we've had this conversation, has your opinion changed at all? That do you feel like it's being used enough, or do you feel like it's being overused, that we see characters coming back to life? Or you feel like it's again more situational and dependent upon the characters themselves?
I am willing to I can go with these different sorts of options that we have for bringing characters back. I think if it fits for the story and it fits for the character, I'm open to it. I think that it's just something that is special about the Star Wars universe, is that life and death, it can be a little bit of a fluid concept sometimes. But if we have situations where it's not set up correctly, or the lore isn't really fully explained ever, then that's where it gets to be like a little bit more tricky, and it's a little bit more of a gamble for them to do that. But I am very willing to accept these, especially when it comes to like the spiritual ways that characters can be brought back. For me, that's easy to get on board with.
And we've got the new Jedi Order coming up as well, so maybe there are going to be stories there. It's going to be interesting to see how Rey is impacted by all of this, if she's impacted at all. There's a lot of questions about whether Ben Solo is still in her ear as he was in the novel, right? What does that relationship look like? Not technically or speaking, but there's I think that is going to play into some of this. Now, maybe not heavy. It won't be heavy handed and that sort of thing, but this whole concept of force spirits and that dyad, I don't think is going to go away. So maybe from there we may get different perspectives and different viewpoints about life after death in Star Wars. But it's something that feels like it is going to be around forever. No pun intended. So looking forward to all the different variations that may come. I have new credits, and I created these and like 3 people signed up. So if you recently signed up and don't see your name, it's nothing personal. I promise I'll get you on the next go around. But these are the new credits that we promised, that we talked about in the Patreon perks. So again, if you're interested in Patreon, head out to cantinacast.com/Patreon. Look at the perks and your name could be on here. So Lauren, thanks for joining me tonight, and we'll see you on the next show.
You're still listening? Wow, that's amazing. Well, I'm here to give you the disclaimer. Normally we do a big, long, drawn-out disclaimer thing saying what's what and who's what and all that other stuff, but I think you guys kind of know that Lucasfilm and Disney have no affiliation with us at all, and we have none with them. We talk about Star Wars, which is their property, and all that other good fun stuff. But I think you can tell which is our stuff and which is their stuff. If you can't, well, then send a lawyer to send an email to me, and I'll be glad to chat with them. Other than that, you know what's what. So that's your disclaimer.